Good morning. This is the second of two lectures on the problem of aggregation in ethics. In our daily lives, and even more commonly in conducting public policy, choices sometimes have to be made between helping either one group of people or another. Because our resources of material and time are finite, we often can't help everyone who has a worthy claim on our aid. So this raises a question. What guidance can moral philosophy give us in making these vexing decisions? What general principles should we appeal to in deciding which group to help? The question that preoccupied us in last lecture was, does it matter how many people will benefit if we help one group rather than another, assuming that the help we could provide to each person is broadly similar in kind? Concretely, we asked, if we must choose between saving the life of one stranger or instead saving the lives of 5 different strangers, what ought we to do? We saw that proponents of classical utilitarianism have a very straightforward way of answering this question. They accept a thesis which we called unrestricted moral aggregation. According to this thesis, in evaluating an action, we should sum the benefits and losses it imposes on different persons to obtain an aggregate quantity. This aggregate quantity characterizes the overall goodness of the action's consequences. And the right action, according to utilitarians, is that which produces the most goodness in the aggregate. What this means is that the rightness or wrongness of an action is a function not of how it affects each person individually. Rather, it is a function of its overall goodness, of the balance of benefits over losses it produces in the aggregate. For the utilitarian, this therefore provides a straightforward answer to the question what to do in the case of 1 versus 5 lives. Of course you have to save the 5. The aggregate goodness of saving 5 lives, she reasons, exceeds the goodness of saving just 1 life. So to do what produces the most goodness in the aggregate, you must save the 5. That's the right thing to do. Now, as we saw in our last lecture, when discussing John Torak's article, Should the Numbers Count?, not all philosophers agree with this answer. For Torak, the mere fact that 5 is a larger number than 1 is not a reason to save the 5. Indeed, we saw, Torak goes further than that. He not only challenges the utilitarian on whether the right thing to do is always to produce the most goodness in the aggregate. He questions whether the utilitarian's notion of aggregate goodness even makes sense. Now, we gave a pretty thorough hearing to Torak's arguments in our last lecture. Some of you may have been persuaded by the case that Torak makes. But I bet that a lot of you, even having read and digested Torak's paper, will continue to hold the view that the right thing to do in a choice between saving 1 life or 5 is to save the greater number. It's just so intuitive that the numbers matter in a case like this. So let's assume for the time being that this is in fact the correct answer. All else equal, we should save the greater number of lives. Does this mean that we should stop worrying and learn to love moral aggregation? Well, not necessarily. Even if this principle has the intuitively correct implication in the 1 versus 5 lives case, we might worry about its implications in other scenarios. Consider, for example, what unrestricted moral aggregation would imply if taken to its logical conclusion. If 5 lives can outweigh 1 life, why not also 50 limbs or 500,000 headaches? So, with that in mind, consider a second case that we already encountered in our first lecture. Let's call this the transmitter room case. Jones has had an accident in a TV broadcasting station that is beaming the World Cup final to 1 billion spectators worldwide. Jones is receiving extremely painful, even life-threatening electrical shocks. Alas, the only way of rescuing Jones from his agony is to shut off the power. But if we do that, the 1 billion viewers will miss out on the last half hour of the World Cup final, and all the pleasure this would have given them. Now, as I said in my first lecture, the pleasure that each individual spectator receives from watching the last half hour of the match is admittedly tiny compared to the excruciating agony that Jones is suffering in the transmitter room. But of course, there are so many spectators, each receiving this small amount of pleasure. For the defender of unrestricted moral aggregation, there must be some number of spectators large enough that the combined benefits to the spectators eventually morally outweigh Jones's agony, even his possible death. Now, it doesn't really matter if that number is 1 billion or if it's higher or lower than that. The point is that by the logic of moral aggregation, if the number of people watching the game gets sufficiently large, the right thing to do eventually becomes leaving the power on. But should there really be such a number? Well, not according to T.M. Scanlon, the philosopher whose work we'll be discussing today. Scanlon judges that it would be wrong not to save Jones from his agony, regardless of how many people are watching the game. The benefit of watching a soccer match, Scanlon reasons, is trivial compared to the agony of suffering strong electrical shocks, potentially losing your life. No matter how large the sum of these tiny benefits, it would be wrong to keep the power on, Scanlon thinks. So, while defenders of moral aggregation give what many consider the intuitively correct verdict in Torek's 1 versus 5 lives case, where what is at stake for each person on either side of the trade-off is a benefit or burden of similar magnitude, the view has pretty counterintuitive implications in cases where the benefits or burdens to be distributed are very different in size. This is especially true in cases like Scanlon's transmitter room case, where it enjoins us to let a few individuals suffer very large burdens so that a large number of people can each receive a fairly minor benefit. Now, a common diagnosis for the inadequacy of aggregative views is that they fail to respect what the philosopher John Rawls has called the separateness of persons. What Rawls means by that is this. Collections or groups of people are not super individuals. Unlike a single individual who may rationally choose to make some sacrifice now in exchange for receiving a stream of benefits later on, a group of people lacks the necessary unity such that imposing a significant harm on one person in the group could be straightforwardly offset by giving sufficient benefits to others. The relations between different people are not like those between different temporal parts of a single life. Let's make it concrete. Suppose you have a dental cavity right now. It's not hurting at the moment, but you know that if you don't do anything about it, it will result in a dull toothache in the future. However, because you hate dentists, fixing the cavity will be very unpleasant for you, and you'll be in considerable pain for a day or two once the local anesthesia wears off. But despite this, it could well be in your interest to get the cavity fixed. The benefits to your future self of being spared a persistent dull headache may, over time, outweigh the cost to your present self of having painful dental surgery. You are compensated, so to speak, for your present pain by benefits to your future selves. Rawls's point is that groups of people are crucially different. There's no sense in which giving many smaller benefits to other people, letting them watch the last half hour of the World Cup final, for example, in any straightforward sense makes up for Jones's agony. Now, a number of leading non-consequentialists have proposed a way of thinking about what to do in a case like transmitter room that promises to better respect the separateness of persons. According to this so-called competing claims model of rightness, morality requires us to determine, by a series of pairwise comparisons, that action or policy which satisfies the strongest individual claim or generates the weakest individual complaint. So the right question to ask isn't which action would produce the greatest net balance of benefits over burdens in the aggregate. The right question to ask is, which action would satisfy the strongest individual claim or generate the weakest individual complaint? Sports fans amongst you can think of this as a kind of single elimination tournament amongst claims. Two claims are compared pairwise. The stronger claim defeats the weaker claim, which is eliminated. But the stronger claim stays in the tournament and is then compared to the next claim, and so on. The tournament is won by the claim which is individually strongest. And the right action is that which satisfies this claim. So, because in transmitter room, Jones's claim to be rescued is far stronger than any spectator's claim to watch the last half hour of the World Cup final, the right thing to do, according to this competing claims model, is to rescue Jones. The fullest development of this anti-aggregative approach is the contractualist moral theory defended by T.M. Scanlon. Tim Scanlon, born 1940, is, without a doubt, one of the greatest living moral philosophers. And I don't just say this because he was my dissertation advisor while I was getting my PhD at Harvard. Besides his work on moral contractualism, which we'll be discussing today, Scanlon has also published important work on freedom of speech, on tolerance, on the value of equality, on the foundations of contract law, on human rights, on conceptions of welfare, on theories of justice, as well as on many of the foundational questions in moral theory that concern us in the first half of this semester. If you ever get a chance to meet him in person, one thing that will quickly strike you about Tim Scanlon, the man, is what an eminently reasonable guy he is. I think you can get a sense of this even from the extended interview with Scanlon that was the bonus video for today's lecture. In fact, Scanlon's reasonableness is so much of a commonplace among his friends that when Scanlon first showed his friend Derek Parfit a draft of his 1982 paper, Contractualism and Utilitarianism, in which Scanlon first outlines the theory of moral contractualism and where the notion of reasonableness features prominently, Parfit remarked, "But Tim, what you've produced isn't an ethical theory. This is just a description of your character." Jokes aside, it's no exaggeration to say that the moral theory which Scanlon began to outline in that 1982 paper, and which culminated in his book What We Owe to Each Other, published in 1998, has emerged as one of the most powerful and systematic challenges to consequentialism. Indeed, as Scanlon writes in Contractualism and Utilitarianism, one of the express aims of the contractualist moral theory is precisely to provide, quote, a clear account of the foundations of non-utilitarian moral reasoning. Now, at the heart of Scanlon's contractualism lies his account of moral right and wrong, which is contained in Chapter 5 of What We Owe to Each Other, the assigned reading for today. Scanlon distills his account of right and wrong to a formula. In the domain of interpersonal morality, an action is morally right if and only if it is justifiable to each person. That is, if and only if a principle permitting the action could not be reasonably rejected for personal reasons as a principle for the general regulation of behavior. Now that's a mouthful. It wouldn't exactly make a good bumper sticker. So I want to spend a lot of the remainder of today's lecture carefully unpacking the various elements of this formula. Let's begin at the beginning of Scanlon's formula, in the domain of interpersonal morality. Scanlon's contractualist formula seeks to capture what it is for an action to be right or wrong in our dealings with other persons, i.e., in the part of morality having to do with our duties to other people, including such things as requirements to aid them and prohibitions against harming, killing, coercion, and deception. This core domain of interpersonal morality is what Scanlon refers to as the domain of what we owe to each other. However, Scanlon does not claim that his contractualist account of right or wrong exhausts morality, in the broad sense in which most people understand it, he writes. For instance, an action may be morally criticizable in a broader sense because it fails to respond appropriately to the impersonal value of some wonder of nature, like the Grand Canyon, or to the badness of animal suffering. If someone were to fill up the Grand Canyon with trash, for example, or to torture cats for fun, this would be wrong, many of us think. But that's not the part of morality that Scanlon's contractualist formula intends to capture. What distinguishes persons from most other animals, according to Scanlon, is that we have what he calls judgment-sensitive attitudes, that is, attitudes that are adopted or withdrawn in accord with appreciation of reasons. According to Scanlon, appreciating the value of the person must involve recognizing and respecting her capacities to assess and act on reasons. And the way to value the rational and self-governing capacity in a person is to treat her in accord with principles that are justifiable to every person, and that consequently she could not reasonably reject. By contrast, Scanlon thinks we cannot meaningfully justify ourselves to most non-human animals who lack the capacity for language and are therefore not capable of holding judgment-sensitive attitudes, he believes. So that is the second element of Scanlon's formula. An action is morally right if and only if it is justifiable to each person. Let me expand a little on that thought. For Scanlon, the requirements of morality are, quote, not just formal imperatives. They are aspects of the positive value of a way of living with others, end quote. Behaving morally towards others, not treating them unjustly, allows us to realize a valuable form of relationship with them, a form of mutual recognition. It is constituted by living with others on terms that they could not reasonably reject, insofar as they are also motivated by this ideal. Indeed, Scanlon argues that much of our motivation to be moral stems from the appeal of standing in this valuable relationship of mutual recognition with other people. As he writes in his book, I quote, "What is particularly moving about charges of injustice and immorality is their implication for our relations with others, our sense of justifiability to or estrangement from them. When we look carefully at the sense of loss occasioned by charges of injustice and immorality, we see it as reflecting our awareness of the importance of being in unity with our fellow creatures." So, if Scanlon is right, the reason to avoid wrongness or injustice is not reducible to avoiding the bad effects of wrongdoing, as the contractualist would have it. Wrongdoing has a significance of its own that goes beyond that of causing suffering or producing other bad effects. By acting wrongly or unjustly towards others, we violate the terms of a relationship of mutual regard. By treating them in ways that they could reasonably reject, we fail to accord them a certain form of respect. This puts us in a very different and less good relation to our fellows. Now, as Scanlon himself points out in chapter 5, the idea that an act is right if and only if it can be justified to each person is one that even non-contractualists might embrace. An act utilitarian, for instance, who believes that an act is right if and only if it maximizes pleasure, could maintain that in any given situation, the only act which is justifiable to each person is that which maximizes pleasure. He would then accept that an act is right if and only if it is justifiable to each person. But the criterion of justifiability to each person is not fundamental to the utilitarian account of moral wrongness. Rather, it is only when and because an act conforms to utilitarianism's fundamental criterion of rightness, namely pleasure maximization, that the utilitarian considers it justifiable to each person. So for the act utilitarian, moral rightness is the logically prior concept on which the notion of justifiability to each person rides piggyback, For the contractualist, by contrast, the idea of justifiability to each person plays a fundamental role in his account of moral right and wrong. Indeed, for Scanlon, the most basic account of what it is for an act to be wrong in the domain of interpersonal morality is simply that it is not justifiable to each person. Okay, but what does it mean for an act to be justifiable to every person? Scanlon's answer to this question is contained in the second half of his formula, and it is here that his theory acquires its distinctly anti-consequentialist character. According to Scanlon, an act is justifiable to each person if and only if a principle permitting the action could not be reasonably rejected by any person for personal reasons as a principle for the general regulation of behavior. An act is wrong if it would be disallowed by some principle that no one could reasonably reject. Okay, so this is where the idea of reasonableness enters in. Now, reasonable rejection for Scanlon is a partly moral notion. In order for our rejection of a moral principle to count as reasonable, we must give appropriate weight to the moral claims of other people. Now, on what grounds can a principle be reasonably rejected? For an answer to this question, let's look to the next part of Scanlon's formula, for personal reasons. For a principle to be reasonably rejectable, Scanlon writes on page 218, there must be someone who can reject it from a personal standpoint, that is, by appealing to the implications that the principle has for her. Reasonable rejection, in other words, has to proceed by appealing to what Scanlon calls personal reasons, that is, quote, reasons that are tied to the well-being, claims, or status of individuals in a particular position, as he puts it on page 219. For example, a personal reason for rejecting a principle could be the burdens that it imposes on you, either by making you worse off or by causing you to forgo potential benefits. An individual might also reject a principle because it treats her unfairly by, quote, singling others out without justification for a privileged moral status, end quote. Even if such fairness-based reasons for rejecting a principle do not necessarily appeal to a person's well-being, Scanlon maintains they are still personal reasons because, as he writes on page 219, they have to do with the claims and status of individuals in certain positions. On the other hand, there are some things that Scanlon explicitly says cannot be appealed to in rejecting a moral principle. In particular, his formula's exclusive focus on personal reasons for rejection incorporates two crucial restrictions, which in the literature are referred to respectively as the personalist and the individualist restriction. The personalist restriction bars us from rejecting a principle on the grounds that it would lead to an outcome that is impersonally bad, independently of its effects on people. As Scanlon puts it, impersonal values do not provide in themselves reason for rejecting principles of right and wrong. Instead, we must be able to point to some person who could reasonably reject a principle based on its implications for her. Let's make this more concrete. Scanlon thinks that you couldn't reject a principle allowing me to turn the Grand Canyon into a giant open-air waste disposal site on the grounds that doing so would destroy a great wonder of nature of incalculable impersonal value. But on the other hand, the many people who would be deprived by my action of the opportunity to visit this natural marvel, well, these people, they could reasonably reject a principle that allowed me to destroy it on the basis of personal reasons. So that's the personalist restriction. The individualist restriction holds that the reasonable rejection of a moral principle must occur by appealing to the principle's implications only for ourselves or for any other single person. In Scanlon's words, quote, the justifiability of a moral principle depends only on individuals' reasons for objecting to that principle and alternatives to it. These two restrictions, the personalist and the individualist restriction, together rule out the kind of moral aggregation that classical utilitarians embrace. Scanlon rejects the thought that the rightness of an action is a function of the overall goodness of its consequences, which is determined by summing its good and bad effects for different individuals. Instead, Scanlon's contractualist formula looks only at the reasons that individual people might have for rejecting a candidate moral principle, based on its effects on them alone as individuals. It does not allow different people to combine or pool their reasons for rejecting a principle. What matters in determining whether a moral principle is justifiable to each person or not is therefore not the sum of different persons' reasons for rejecting the principle, but merely how the strongest individual reason for rejecting this principle compares to the strongest individual reason for rejecting any alternative principle. A principle cannot be reasonably rejected, according to Scanlon, if the strongest objection that any individual can make against it is weaker than the strongest objection that could be made to any relevant alternative principle. As Scanlon writes in Contractualism and Utilitarianism, it would be unreasonable to reject a principle because it imposed a burden on you, when every alternative principle would impose much greater burdens on others. Let's call this Scanlon's greater burden principle. Finally, let's look at the last part of Scanlon's formula, as a principle for the general regulation of behavior. Why do we need this? Well, in deciding whether a given principle could be reasonably rejected, Scanlon thinks, we mustn't look only to how specific individuals would be affected by the actions licensed by the principle in specific circumstances. Rather, we must take a broader and more abstract perspective, which takes into account not only the consequences of particular actions, but also the consequences of general performance of such actions and all the other implications of having agents be licensed to act in the way that the principle allows or requires. For example, as Scanlon writes, our need for privacy is not met simply because, as a matter of fact, other people do not listen in on our phone calls and go through our personal files. In order to have the benefits of privacy, we need to have assurance that this will not happen. And this is something that only the general acceptance of a principle can provide. All right, so much for my brief overview of Scanlon's contractualist ethical theory. Let's now return to the specific issue of interpersonal aggregation. Scanlon thinks that his view can capture our intuitions about the two central cases that have preoccupied us in today's lecture. Torek's basic case, where you can save either 1 or 5 lives, and Scanlon's own transmitter room case. Let's consider them in reverse order. Contractualism gives the intuitively correct verdict about transmitter room, Scanlon thinks. Turning off the power is the only course of action that is justifiable to everyone, since Jones's personal reasons for rejecting a principle that allowed us to continue the transmission are much weightier than any individual's reasons against interrupting the broadcast. Now, the fact that there are a large number of people with personal reasons for not wanting the broadcast to be interrupted, this is deemed morally irrelevant under the individualist restriction. So far, so good. But now you might worry, if Scanlon wishes to exclude all forms of moral aggregation, does this mean that he is committed to John Torek's view in Torek's basic case? Must Scanlon agree with Torek that in a choice between saving the life of a single person and saving the life of a group of persons, there is no moral reason to save the greater number? That would be a troubling result, since many of us, we said, find Torek's views about his basic case deeply counterintuitive. Well, happily, Scanlon thinks he is not committed to this conclusion. He allows that in cases where we must choose between preventing a smaller or a larger number of people from suffering a burden of equivalent magnitude, for example, saving 1 from death or saving 5 from death, the relative numbers can break the tie. His discussion here borrows from Francis Cam's balancing argument, which we discussed in last lecture. But even here, Scanlon thinks his reasoning remains non-aggregative. In a choice between saving A or saving both B and C, for example, it would be wrong to flip a coin, he thinks. But not because two deaths represent a greater total loss. Rather, following Cam, Scanlon argues that a principle which did not allow numbers to break the tie in this case could be reasonably rejected by both B and C for failing to take account of the value of saving their life, since, quote, it permits the agent to decide what to do in the very same way that it would have been permitted had he not been present at all, and there was only one person in each group. So, has Scanlon managed to square the circle? It seems that he has shown us how to simultaneously hold on to and justify two judgments that strike many people as strongly intuitive. First, that in a choice between saving the life of one stranger, let's call him A, or that of 5 other strangers, you're morally required to save the lives of the 5. But secondly, that faced with a choice between saving the life of one stranger, A, or preventing any number of other strangers from suffering a much more minor burden, such as mild frustration or a minor headache, you're morally required to save A's life. By contrast, both Torek and the utilitarian can each endorse no more than one of these intuitive claims. Torek would endorse the latter and reject the former, whereas classical utilitarians endorse the former but are committed to rejecting the latter. So, has Scanlon cracked the problem of aggregation in ethics? Alas, I think there is still a problem lurking. It is one thing to say that the numbers don't matter when it's a case of one person's life versus many people's minor headaches or mild frustrations, as in Scanlon's transmitter room case. But what about a case where what is at stake for the many, while individually less weighty than what's at stake for the one, is still pretty close in seriousness? So to make this vivid, suppose you could save one from death or 1,000 others from becoming paralyzed. Let's imagine full body paralysis. What's the right thing to do? Is it plausible that there could be no number of people whom you should spare from paralysis instead of saving a single person's life? Scanlon admits that that seems too extreme. Although there is no number of headaches large enough to outweigh the moral importance of saving one life, it is plausible that there may be some harms less serious than death, but close enough, such as the harm of full-body paralysis, perhaps, such that preventing a certain number of such harms may take precedence over saving one person from death. However, given the individualist restriction and the greater burden principle, it's unclear whether Scanlon's view has the space to accommodate this moral judgment. Now, Scanlon himself sketches out two possible responses in Chapter 5 of What We Owe to Each Other, and I want to end with that. First, he suggests, we could lump burdens together into what he calls broad categories of moral seriousness. As he writes on page 238, the distinctions on which the principles I have argued for rely are distinctions between broad categories of moral seriousness. Slight differences in what happens, such as a pain's lasting a little longer or a person losing 2 fingers rather than 3, do not make the difference between a very serious loss and a moderate one, and the differences between these moral categories are not slight. What Scanlon is suggesting is that when the unequal harms are close enough in moral seriousness, when they belong in the same broad category, we can apply the tie-break argument already discussed. Now, whatever the merits of this argument, however, it seems that it had better not apply to a choice between two harms as different as life and paralysis, lest it generate counterintuitive implications. To see this, consider a choice between saving 999 people from death or 1,000 people from becoming paralyzed. Clearly, the thing to do here is not to save the 1,000 from paralysis, even if this satisfies the greater number of relevant claims. So it's unclear, I think, how much this first proposal will help us decide how to trade off the prevention of paralysis and the prevention of death. Let us look at Scanlon's second tentative proposal. On page 239, he writes, "It might be claimed that if the less serious harms are nonetheless morally relevant to the more serious ones, this means that a principle requiring, or perhaps even permitting one always to prevent the more serious harms in such a case, could reasonably be rejected from the point of view of someone in the other group, on the ground that it did not give proper consideration to his admittedly less serious, but still morally relevant loss. One might then argue that such an individual's claim to have his or her harm taken into account can be met only by a principle that is sensitive to the numbers of people involved on each side. I am not certain how such an argument would go, but it does not seem to me to be excluded in advance by the general idea of contractualism." End quote. So Scanlon here is really disarmingly upfront that he hasn't fully worked out the details of this second idea. But I think in its rough contours, it amounts to the following proposal. The numbers count, and not just to break ties when people's individual claims are equivalent in strength, but also when people's claims are close enough in strength to be morally relevant to one another. For example, should I save A from death or save 1,000 others from paralysis? Perhaps I ought to do the latter, since the individual burden of paralysis is close enough to the burden of death that the numbers can count, and the claims of 1,000 people to be spared from paralysis together outweigh the claim of one person to be spared from death. By contrast, consider a choice between saving A from death or saving 1 billion people from a minor headache. Here, I must do the former, because the individual burden of a headache is too small compared to the burden of death to be morally relevant in this context. So here, the numbers don't count. Is this a promising general strategy, do you think? Or are there pitfalls? I propose that we take up this question in our town hall. I look forward to our discussion.